So welcome sa atong podcast no nga at the habits. So nga to ang guest ato karon no sa pinakangilngig nga psychologist o head of services diri sa RBE Psychological Services. So siya gyud ato ang nagpangulo ani nga mga podcast nga atong gipahigayon diri sa RBE. No, wala na laing lipod-lipod ang ato ang topics karon no, kung pag-istoryahan karon is building healthy habits no, pag kining buhat na to no, or pag himo na to og kining mga nindot og kining healthy nga habits para sa atong kaugalingon ug para sa future no sa ato. So welcome Sir Robby sa ato ang episode na number 1 no. So number 1, so we are live at the YouTube, sa our YouTube channel RB Psychological Services. So please welcome Robby, and pwede nimo i-introduce imong para sila, para na sila yung background of may layla kanila.
Thank you very much, Jerly, for having me here in your podcast program at the Habits, and Pit Senior to you and all those who are tuning in to us via the multiple social media platforms, wanting to listen to this discussion for the next few minutes. My name is Robby Echavez. I am, as you said, Jerly, a psychologist and head of services at RBE Psychological Services. I'm a registered psychometrician, a registered psychologist, and a registered guidance counselor. I'm glad to be joining Jerly and all of us today.
So Pit Senior Sir Robby, Pit Senior sa ato ang mga kaigsunan no nga nasa online no. So dili na nato dugay-dugayon no, ang ato nang una natong pangutana ni Sir Robby is what is the importance of changing our healthy habits. So Sir Robby, pwede nimo i-discuss or isulti sa ilahag unsa may mga importansya sa pag create sa atong healthy habits no.
A lot of what we do revolve around patterns of behavior. And one way we can define habits is by seeing them as that, seeing them as patterns of talking, patterns of moving around. It's composed, when you break down the concept of a habit, it's composed of these elementary or smaller pieces that refer to feelings and ways of thinking, ways of being and doing things that we do over time. And habits are important when we look at ourselves, and more specifically our mental health, because a lot of what we do and a lot of how we are as human beings revolve around these patterns. We're talking about sets of things that we say. These are verbal behaviors. We can refer to internal experiences, such as the way we subjectively feel through our emotions, as comprising these habits. It can be said that when we look at human nature, when we look at human behavior, from the things that we do at work to what we do intimately with loved ones, at home, with our families, in the communities, that comprises, or that shows you what we do out of habit. In fact, when you were preparing for this podcast, you mentioned, Jerly, this idea that you stumbled upon. It's a very common or popular belief to say or to describe the human being as creatures of habit. And that phrase, I think, summarizes just how important and relevant habits are in trying to understand the way we are as human beings. The importance of habits isn't just constrained or limited to how we are as Homo sapiens. Other animals, such as hamsters, dolphins, aquatic creatures, birds, even we can debate or argue um, far more basic uh, living things, such as unicellular creatures at the microscopic level, have habits. They have patterns of behavior. They move and operate and do what they do in a certain way. So habits aren't just important in understanding how we are as human beings, the way we tick. It's also important that relevance also extends to every other living creature, I dare say, in the planet. So it's relevant because it's something that summarily describes who we are. If you want to know a particular person, whether at a very intimate level, whether you want to know a group of individuals, as in how people are in a particular organization, factory, or company, or whether it's about knowing a population, like people who live in a particular geographical area, it would be wise to ask the question, what are the habits of this person? What are the habits of this particular group of individuals? What are the habits that define this particular culture? So it's relevant in many ways, not only to human beings, as I put it at the first part of my response. It's also relevant in so many different levels, whether you're looking at the individual level, the mezzo level, as it said, with groups and that's smaller and larger groups, or with whole communities, with whole societies. Habits define and give us a snapshot of a thumbnail, if you will, of how we can understand particular persons, groups of persons, and whole populations. The second way that habits are important, apart from the first, which we spoke about, that is they uh, they tell us something about how organisms tick. The second idea, which is it gives you that thumbnail or that sketch of how people, groups of people, and whole societies are. That leads us to the third importance of uh, why psychology and why all the rest of us, whether we're in different fields, such as medicine, or whether we're in the field of education, why we should bother about habits. Uh, and I think this third one is particularly human. And uh, I would like to introduce you and all those who are listening to us tonight, whether you're in a different time zone, it might be the day where you are at the moment, to the work I did to complete my clinical psychology graduate studies. So back in March 2013, I presented my graduate thesis entitled Beyond the Trees and the Forests, Surveying the Valley of Personality Psychology through a Proposed Meta Theory. And I'm introducing this to you and to all those out there who are listening to this discussion, to this talk, because I believe what I found out in that thesis responds to the question, this first one that you mentioned, and the other questions which you might have about habits, their relevance, how to change them, and so on and so forth. What I did in that thesis was to analyze 218 documents or 218 texts. In the textual analysis of these 218 documents, I found out these were all documents that said something about personality. And when I said that habits are relevant because they describe an organism and the way we tick, the way we behave, and that habits are important to understand and to know more about because they can give you a summary, uh, a bird's eye view of not just a particular or a specific organism, but also an individual, a human person, groups of persons, and whole communities. I looked at 218 personality articles, if you will say, and I found out that there were 32 conceptual lenses and 4 super lenses, which um, part of these lenses talk about responses to this question. So I'd like to go to page 108 of uh, the manuscript. What I have with me uh, right now is a manuscript of that um, thesis. And in that page, I wrote a section entitled Behavioral Project. And this, I think, underlines and reinforces what I've been saying in the last 15 minutes. I hope you will allow me to read that part. Um, it says, and I quote, I wrote, and I quote, a list of other themes concerned constructs borrowed from approaches to personality. And these were very similar to the groupings where such schools or traditions like cognitive, logical, radical, classical, Watsonian, Skinnerian behaviorism. At first glance, it may seem like these 4 thematic clusters are differentiated. When viewed from a different angle, however, one will see several red threads which form the undercurrent of a behavioral project. This is the third um, response to your question. It's important to study habits because they underpin what in my graduate thesis I termed the behavioral project. What is this behavioral project? Most notable of these red threads which define this behavioral project, the third and final reason habits are important for us to study, would be behaviorism making behavior the primary or focal datum within personality science. The analyzed themes, I continue to write, point out to the idea that having enjoyed enormous popularity within psychology and having wielded influence in the discipline, albeit for a limited period, behaviorism had made it a point to turn the gaze of personality science towards behavior as the unit of primary interest, even at times suggesting more extremely that the notion that behavior might be the only scientifically viable object for study. In other words, what this part of my graduate thesis says about the importance of habits is that behaviorism, you can say that habits are behaviors. Of course, as I've defined them, I believe they include more than just behaviors. But in the main, habits are patterns of behaviors. And what the behavioral project did around the start of, I would say, the 19th or 20th centuries was to acknowledge that it's important to be looking at behaviors or habits because these behaviors or habits are things that we can quickly see, things that we can quickly understand, observe from people. And because we can observe them, Julie, it's easier to be able to change them. That is, habits seem to be the key to changing um, how we are as human beings. Other people might believe that the key to changing the way we are is to look at our feelings or to look at our thoughts. But for the behavioral project, and I suppose when we look at habits, habits are the key to change human persons. When you change habits, you change human beings. When you change the habit of one person or a group of persons or an entire community, such as the health habits, masking is a habit, for example. Um, because we've been through the pandemic, We can talk about health related habits, such as masking, putting on a mask. This wasn't a habit before. To change habits, to establish habits which were not there um, in groups of people, the key is behavior, not feelings, not thoughts, at least for the behavioral project. So the third reason why habits are important for psychology to look into is because they are keys to change. Of course, needless to say, this is positive change. We can also think about very bad changes because there are also bad habits, right? So those are the three reasons why I think um, habits are important. First, they tend to define an organism and the way that organism lives out its life. Second, they provide summary descriptions. If you want to understand someone quickly, understand a habit, right? So it's like a shortcut. It's like a shortcut for understanding someone. Thirdly, habits are important to be looking into because when you change habits, you change human beings. When you change the habits of a dog or a pet, you change that pet. You change that creature or you change that organism. So that's the third and final reason why habits are of so much relevance.
So, as we heard po Sir Robby no nga, habits is the key for a change. And it is kanang importance no nga uh, knowing ourselves and other people or group of people in the community. No? So, karon sir nga we know nga kining habits is the key for a change, no? In all aspect of our lives. Why most people are so or hesitant in terms of changing a healthy habits?
Mm. This is a very universal experience. Um, Trying to change and doing that by establishing new habits. It might be said acquiring new habits for habits that you've never tried before. Um, why is that difficult? It's a very common question. In fact, there's a quotation that's attributed to St. Paul. I think it's in the Bible, it's in the Holy Book. I cannot say it verbatim, but the idea was I don't understand why it's so difficult for me to do what I intend to do. That is, St. Paul is saying or asking himself why it's so difficult to be changing himself, to be changing a habit. If it's a bad habit that you want to transform into a good one, St. Paul, and this is just an example of just how widespread this dilemma is. It's not just your problem or mine. It's the problem of so many people. In fact, again, I keep going back to this because it's a very relevant experience. When the pandemic started, masking as a habit was very difficult to establish. A lot of people found it very difficult. It's just wearing a mask, you know. Behaviorally speaking, it's picking up a mask, putting it on, and leaving it on until you're back home safely. That's what it involves, right? But the question raises, and I think underlines that dilemma. Why was it so difficult for so many people? And it's not just Filipinos. We did fairly well, by the way, with the masking mandate. We knew somewhere in the middle of the pandemic, I think after the first year of the pandemic, that compared to most other populations, the Filipino population were very good at having established that habit of masking compared to a lot of other cultures. Not to say anything about other cultures, but it does say something about why is it so hard to establish um, even a good habit, right? Well, my thinking draws me back to um, two theories: the theory of planned action um, and self-determination theory. Somewhere along the uh, meeting of these two theories, the theory of planned action and self-determination theory, is the idea of what's called an intention behavior. When you ask why is it so difficult to start a new habit or to establish even a positive habit, um, it makes me think about that concept called the intention behavior gap. What that is, according to St. Paul, is me having the intention to change a particular habit, but not being able to translate that plan into action. So there's a gap between my plan to change a habit or to adopt a new habit and doing something about it so that I can start doing that habit. For example, I have the intention of going vegan, right? Eating vegetables and fruits and not eating any sort of meat. That's an intention. That's a plan that I have. That's a goal I have in my mind. Um, Yet to this day, despite having planned that for myself and despite intending to start that habit, I have yet to actually be successful in translating this habit, in translating this plan of a habit to become actual behavior. There's a gap there. So, um, the first my first answer to this question of why is it so hard is because there's that gap. Now, of course, this begs the question: what causes that gap then? Why is there a gap between our intentions and our behaviors? Um, it's a very difficult question, and again, it's a question that has been raised over and over again. As I said earlier, even by Saint Paul himself. Why is it so hard for me to do the things I want to do, and so easy for me, because there's a second part of that quotation, and so easy for me to do the things I don't want to do, right? So there might be an intention, for example, not to drink anymore. Um, New Year's resolutions. This is the stuff of New Year's resolutions too. We have New Year's resolutions which go something like, I don't want to drink as much alcohol as I did the previous year. Meaning, I want to cut back on my alcohol intake. That can go for gambling, it can go for smoking, it can go for sex, it can go for other activities. Um, but whatever it is, the idea is to cut back. That's the intention. But many people fail in putting that intention into real action, into concrete behavior, to form or to change a bad habit into a good one, right? Um, what lies behind, and I think I'll end here with regards this response to the second question of why it's so difficult. Personally, after my graduate thesis, I found out that there are not just dualities, but that as human beings we often try to break down our experience. We try to synthesize our experience by first breaking it into smaller parts. And I think that's the reason behind the intention behavior gap. The reason is because we don't find, um, we don't, well, sometimes we don't even bother looking for the connections between our plans or our intentions and our behaviors. In other words, we consider them differently. There's a good term which I've been hearing quite a lot of at the start of the year, and it's called silo. People silo experiences. When we say silo, we mean we segregate experiences. We categorize experiences, classify them, name them, and we say this is a behavior, this is a feeling, this is a thought, this is an intention, this is a plan, this is action, etc. We put them into small boxes. There's nothing wrong with this because most of the times it makes life simple. But I believe in the intention behavior gap that theorists from the theory of planned action and self-determination theory have been looking on for decades. This is decades of research. This is a fruit of decades of research for both these groups of scholars or researchers. I think this is a personal hunch, something born out of clinical practice rather than experimentation or any other type of method, is that when we silo our experiences, we lose the connections. We fail to see that it's not just intentions without connection to your behaviors. It doesn't mean that when we categorize all this, we might be right in the categorization. But even if we're right in having siloed them this way, what happens is we lose the connection. And it's when we don't bother to look at what is the connection between my plan and my behavior. My intention to adopt a habit, to change a habit, to alter a habit, and my behavior of actually doing that. When we forget that connection, the intention behavior gap widens. So, one way, for example, I'm sure you're gonna ask this in the next few minutes, but just to put the cart, before the horse, it can be said, I can say that one way of making that difficulty less difficult is by constantly reviewing your plans, constantly reviewing your intentions, and then asking yourself what the bridges, connections, or the links are between that intention to say to be vegan and the behavior of actually being vegan. When you draw that connection and when you keep coming back to that, I think it will narrow the intention behavior gap and it will make what was once difficult a bit easier.
So naagi day connection no sa diri sa gap no sa imong intention ug the way you execute or you take actions ng tanso na siya connection. So katong silong imong gingon si Robby mo to siya one of the reason why we disconnect no ana nga gap. So kaning question ako next, Robby, is mental health ni siya no mga about is kani bang mga gaps no or kaning reason why we are hesitants or kaning dili mo pag-change sa ato ang habits usa ba ni sa mga hinungdan nganong sometimes we are mentally unstable no or installment.
Yes, I would say a very quick yes to this. And as far as mental health is concerned, we deal a lot with helping and supporting and guiding, perhaps even teaching in the work that we do as clinicians, other people, so that they get to work around what habits have been distressing for them, what habits have been difficult, have caused difficulty or suffering. We can talk about one of the most dysfunctional habits, addiction. We know from the film Tipping the Pain Scale. This was a 2021 film by Jay Riley, directed by Jay Riley, and what they're trying to say in that film is that addiction has become a pandemic in the United States. Um, it's been a long time coming too. I mean, I think that's always been there. It's the elephant in the room. It's always been a huge problem, not just for the United States, but for many countries. Addiction. When all is said and done, addiction is just another habit. It's just another pattern of behaviors. And addiction is part of the DSM-5 TR, which is, of course, our guidebook or our manual to be understanding mental health concerns. So what I'm saying is that yes, these habits can be the cause of mental distress. They can be the cause of suffering. They can be the cause of relational problems. They can be the cause of problems of thinking or problems of feeling. They can be the cause of dysfunction at work, in school, for those who are still studying, and with families, for those who are full-time parents. Habits have to be contended with in clinical work. There was a American psychologist, George Kelly, the proponent of PCP or personal construct psychology. And I remember him in response to your question about how habits can lead to mental distress or mental health problems. The basis of PCP were, of course, constructs. And constructs, it can be said, can be understood as including habits. When we construct the idea of, say, addict, for example, the construct of the addict, certain things come up. And what comes up is that the addict may be someone who abuses a particular drug. The addict may have very traumatic experiences early on. The addict is a liar, negative stereotypes. These are associated thoughts that many people have. Addicts are manipulative. They are antisocial. They're deviants, etc. So a lot of associated things. When you take those apart, all that you have left really are habits. The habit of lying, for example, the habit of using, the habit of manipulating others, the habit of being antisocial, the habit of being aggressive or violent. Those are habits too. You can call them as habits. Whatever other name you might have for them, the word habit fits the bill of many of these things that cause distress or cause difficulty among so many millions of individuals worldwide. And George Kelly, beginning PCP, when he talks about construct, he tells us that when we change constructs, let me just replace the word constructs with habits, having established that habits are part of constructs. When we try changing our habits, we earlier heard about the behavioral project and the thesis that if you want to change human beings, habits are the key, right? So George Kelly, talking about PCP, discovered that when constructs or habits change, they cause a disturbance. They cause a disturbance. Some of these disturbances may lead to something good. Like when I cut down, for example, if I decide to cut down on my drinking, and I say, I won't drink as much anymore, a disturbance that can be caused by that would be this very uncomfortable feeling. So sometimes I might try looking for a drink because I'm missing. Let's just suppose I did not drink since the beginning of the year, right? So this causes a disturbance because, well, in addiction language or in addictology, we talk about withdrawal. Withdrawal is a disturbance because you begin to, well, apart from all the other, it's a very complicated phenomenon, of course, and I do not want to minimize the suffering caused by withdrawal, but certainly one part of it is the craving. So that's a disturbance. When you start craving for your next hit or the next bottle, you feel disturbed. Mm. And it is that disturbance that can sometimes lead to a relapse, a full blown relapse, so that you quote unquote fail in your cutting back and establishing a healthier habit. Um, Other times, it's the disturbance that actually pushes you on and allows you to change further. So it can have those positive effects of really urging you on because, for example, if I reframe it in behavioral technology terms, when I reframe my understanding of my disturbance and I say, I know it will only get worse before it gets better, then this might push the person to continue changing. Sige lang kay karon naman pud ni, no? I was prepared for this. I know that I'm going to be craving for alcohol, so I'm prepared for it. I know I'm in the right track, so I should just continue going. I should just continue sobering up. For others, it can be very difficult. For others, it can be the pull that they
Grab nila.
yes that they've always wanted to avoid. You know, they hope that they never crave for the substance again. So it pulls them back, and others into a slip or a lapse, others into a full blown relapse. So this is the reason why it causes all these why it's very relevant to talk about habits in mental health. Many distresses and many psychological dysfunctions are attributable to habits, bad habits, unhealthy habits, poor habits, deficient habits. And when we change them, perhaps this is a throwback to your earlier question, why is it difficult to change? Another reason is from George Kelly himself, the father of PCP, because when we change, even for the better, it causes a lot of disturbance. So even if you're wanting to change and adopt a positive habit, at the very beginning, it can be really difficult. It can cause anxiety, and this is in fact how he defines anxiety. George Kelly says that when we try to establish new habits or new constructs, what happens is that it might not fit. It might not fit with how we are currently. For example, if I want to be vegan, one thing that might make it difficult for me is how it doesn't fit. You see, everyone else, no one's a vegan in my home. See, everyone else eats meat, fish, chicken, red meat, etc. Everyone eats it. Okay. When I try to adopt the new habit, one thing that's difficult for me is because it's so hard to do that because it doesn't fit with where I am. If everyone was vegan except me, and if I wanted to be vegan like everyone in my home, it can be easier. It can be easier for me. And it's the same thing too. When you're trying to change a personality pattern, for example, let's just say you're a hothead, right? You get mad all the time, you lose control over your anger, you say hurtful words, and you want to change that habit. I don't want to badmouth anyone. I don't want to slap anyone. I don't want to say or do hurtful things to anyone. If it jives with your personal construct system, as George Kelly and PCP would put it, if it jives with how others are in your environment, in your family, then that might be something you can actually pull off. But if you're trying to change that while everyone around you is angry, while everyone around you is screaming and shouting and hurting everybody else, it becomes extremely difficult. So it's almost like the case of damned if I do, damned if I don't. If I change a habit, it will be difficult. If I don't change a habit and if I remain constantly angry, it will still be difficult. So what do I do? So it's like you're torn in the middle. You're paralyzed in the middle over what to do because changing for the better, adopting new habits, positive ones, healthier ones is difficult. Staying with the old habits is difficult too. This causes a lot of anxiety, to say the very least. So that's my response to this question of why is it that habits are relevant to mental health? It's relevant to mental health first because so many psychological, neuropsychiatric disorders revolve around habits. Second, it's relevant to be talking about habits in mental health because um, adopting healthier habits, picking up healthier habits, establishing healthier habits, uh, often often it is often associated with difficulties, with challenge. Okay, and I think one way to overcome that challenge is to know that it's coming. It's to know that this is gonna be a hard time for me. I will probably relapse. I will probably crave. I will probably slip. I will probably forget my resolution or my intention. Just being aware of that is staying one step ahead of trying to change and adapting newer, forming better habits.
So daghan day kayo mga there's a lot of causes no in terms of kining uh, pag relate no relevance sa mental health, especially kani pong pag change na to no kay nay siya kining na something missing sa atong self nga mahitabo no. So mo nay hinungdan usahay nga mag-craves ta no nya na mga mahitabo sa atong kaugalingon. So mo nay usa sa mga answers sa atong previous question. So right now we take a break for a minute so that mo sunod na pud tag line questions if kanang mobalik ta. So na lang. Ya, di na kong lupaw na. Pag ito lupaw na nun. Pabalik. Wala rin din mga pagbuo na. Ito pong murag.
Anxiety.
Hindi ka pong lingon na murag ng kuwan siya. Ito yung lingon na murag something na pagbusin ng lingon kung yung kuwan ito. Na mga sa baka nakapush nyo call out nyo.
Yep. Yep.
Saan mo itong question nyo? Kanina tangguan. What can we do? Tulo na lang na question. Bububuan na lang. Ano na lang tayo sa
Pilang ka minutes na nabilin man?
40 na lang ba?
Okay.
So, kaning create new habit mo, ngayon na lang ganun yung ganun. Pila ka steps. So, we're back no sa atuang podcast no. So, so far we've learned a lot from our guest no, si Sir Robby Echavez no, tuang psychology. Since he is a psychologist no, ato siyang pangutanon if we are in the situation nga kanang we are stressed, hopeless, and burned out, and we are psychologically distressed. So, unsa man nato ni siya pag himo sir no? Unsa man nato siya pag unsa atong mabuhat kumbaga sa pag-change atong habits para sort of mabalik ta sa kining normal na atong routine.
Right. Thank you very much, Jerly, for having me here in your podcast. And thanks to everyone out there who's listening. Uh, I During the break, you asked me about uh, the effects of adapting even positive habits. So, picking up positive habits or healthy habits doesn't sound as easy as it looks. It's not as easy as it looks. When you say, "Oh, I can pick up a good habit. It's a positive habit anyway." We've learned that even from PCP or personal construct psychology, what it says is that the adapting um, healthier habits can cause anxiety. It can cause dread. George Kelly also talked about dread. Um, in other words, when you adapt something new, it it shakes up the tree, so to speak. Um, when you're when you're trying to form a new habit, you'll have to make it fit in how you are as a person already. So, in other words, there's a lot of adjustment that needs to be done. And sometimes those adjustments can be very difficult. Um, Depression, hopelessness, anxiety, these mental health concerns, personality disorders, um, they're already difficult to contend with. They're already like mountains to climb
Decline.
and to overcome. Uh, and knowing that to overcome these mental health difficulties, uh, the changing of constructs or habits is difficult too, mm, makes it even harder. But it is not something. It's not something hopeless. It has been done before. A lot of people have. If a lot of people have failed, a lot of people have succeeded too. You know, in fact, you and I, we won't be here if we did not change our habits. Um, if you remained the way you were back in grade one, or how I was as a 14 or 15-year-old, and if I did not adapt new habits, I wouldn't be able to graduate from high school. If I did not adapt new habits in college, if I did not form positive habits while working, I wouldn't I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be even able to do this podcast. Doing a podcast, learning how to do it, is picking up a habit. It's forming a habit, and um, the 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 fact that we're both here, the fact that listeners are over there tuning into this podcast means that we're always, we're always in that process of picking up new habits, turning bad habits into better ones, um, taking away very poor habits or very deficient habits. So it's always a process. The multi-million dollar question, of course, is how do we do it, right? That's the question, too, of the behavioral project I was talking about earlier. The behavioral project isn't just something that focuses our attention on habits and behaviors. It also pushes us to think about what's called behavioral technology in my graduate thesis. So I'll open it up again, and I'm just glad that I thought about bringing this work or bringing this paper or this study into the podcast because I was right. I was right that it would answer a lot of the questions which are being raised tonight. Um, in page 106, this just a few pages before the section that I read, he talks about another lens, another way of understanding habits and, well, generally human beings, personality. And this one is termed behavioral technology. When we, there are a lot of ways we can change habits or we can change constructs. Um, and one predominant way, I think, has been the behavioral way. So I would In my study, I called them behavioral technology. I started this section by writing, and I quote, behavioral change is not possible without the explication of appropriate and adequate methods. Your question is about methods.
Yeah,
What are
methods.
things we can do or use to change habits? The methods for effecting behavioral change are bracketed together as behavioral technology, subsuming such extracted themes as practical applications, applied psychology, behavioral control, environmental control, applied practitioner. These are terms I took from the 218 documents that I in this proposal or in this study. In an extant, the words model, control, processes, assessment, and analysis all occurred more than 100 times in the behavioral articles set. I want to go to the end of the section where it talks about the important themes which are hallmarks of the behavioral technology lens. And these have been extracted from the 218 texts that I reviewed. These are situation, these are just words I'll explain in a bit. Um, Watsonian behaviorism, Skinner's radical behaviorism, and the ideas of Hull and Pavlov, and what is called the SORC statement. Hmm. Let me go through this one by one as a response to your question, what can we do? First, the first thing that we can do is to study the situation.
Studies.
If you want to change a habit, most of us, we begin in ourselves, right? Like,
Yes.
we try to reflect and we try to see how we were the previous year. That's our starting point. And that's a good starting point, don't get me wrong. It's a great way to be starting um, the the process of changing a habit. I think, however, that that common traditional way also blinds us to looking at what social psychologists call the power of the situation. Situations are powerful. If you put a noisy man inside a church, do you think he'll still be noisy?
Mm, probably. Probably not.
If you put a sexually explicit or lewd person in the company of sisters, mga madre, nay tao nga bastos kayo, bastos kay bakba, na silag fuck you, silag kanang punyeta, or putang ina, kung imo na siyang ibutang, nga ang iyahang kuyog puros madre, question, mamalikas pa ba siya?
Mm, malikas pa siguro kay mo naman yung behavior.
Unya, tan-aw nimo sa iyang pagpamalikas, musaka or maubos?
Depende siguro sa sitwasyon.
The power of the situation. The power of the situation from the viewpoint of social psychologists is to say that when you put a noisy man in an environment or a situation that does not reinforce being rowdy or noisy, the noisy man can quickly become a silent person.
Silent person.
When you put a noisy person in a church, and let's just suppose this noisy person knows, I mean, he understands what the church is, and he understands what's expected of people in the church. Tatahimik ang taong ito. Siguro, like you said, siguro nandyan pa rin yung kadaldalan niya, pero this decreases. The overall trend is for the power of the situation to affect this person. And that's number one in behavioral technology. If we want to change habits, don't stop at analyzing yourself or knowing more about yourself. Self-awareness seminar, recollection, retreat. Study the situation too. Study your environment. Know more about it. What is in the environment that's not helping you change? Kung ikaw ni akong gisulti ganina, kung ikaw di na kaganahan magpalahubog, pero tanan sa imong palibot palahubog, lisod kaayo tungod sa sitwasyon. Pero kung tanan pod sa imong palibot nagsuporta nimo, nga sila pong tanan dili na pod sila ganahan mo inom, masayon. This is the power of the situation. When you are in a group that influences you to do and to change according to your intention, the behavior becomes easier to do. Second, the SORC statement. The SORC statement is stimulus, organism, response, change. That is the SORC statement. It tells us to look at four things. The last, of course, is the change, right? It's also important in behavioral technology, and if we want to change our habits, it's important to also envision the change that you want to make. Make that very clear in your head or in your mind. When you say, I will cut back on my cigarettes, what does that mean? Does that mean out of the one pack that you finish a day, do you want to have that? Is that what cutting back means? Is it just one stick a day? So you have to have a clear vision of what the habit change is going to be like and is how it's going to transform you. That's the C part of the SORC statement. Before that, however, you study the stimulus or the stimuli, kaning mga triggers, mga buttons nga kana bitang mga panghitabo nga kung mahitabo na siya, lisod kaayo nga dili mo respond the same way. For example, ug init kay kag ulo, and if you want to change being such a hothead, when you resolve to yourself, you know what, I don't want to be an angry person anymore. What you're trying to do is you're giving yourself a vision of what that is. When you say, that means when someone, and this is the S now, you're going back to the S. When someone says something that does not agree with me, kung naay musupak na ko, mo na stimulus, no? I will tune in. I will tune in to what I feel. I will ask myself, no? Usa ko mubukas akong baba, usa ko musulti, usa ko mubuhat og anything, ako sang tan-awon, unsa may akong gibati? Mao nang O, organism. Ikaw na, no, ang organism, ang individual. Balik sa imong kaugalingon. And then the response. The response is, I don't want to lash out anymore. What I would want to do is to ask a question. Such as, imbis nga moingon ka, ha? Naunsa ka diha? Moingon ko nga, unsa day nahitabo? Behavioral technology, SORC. After studying the situation, create an SORC statement. Third, Watsonian behaviorism. Watson was, of course, famous for his little Albert experiment, where they made these associations. These were basically extensions of associationism, which was studied earlier by E.L. Thorndike. This third one, Watsonian behaviorism, in other words, tells us about associations. Tanawa ang imong mga conditioning. Look at your conditioning. Look at the associations that you make between one event and another. Daghan kaayo na itong mga habits nga conditioning, prior conditioning siya. This is also called programs. You know, like computers are run by programs, we're also run by programs. Like 12 o'clock, gutom na ko. Conditioning mo na siya. No? You won't die, actually, if you don't eat at 12 o'clock, or if you don't eat during the lunch hour from 12 to 1, you won't die. However, Your programming tells you, I need to eat
Mm.
because
Wala
it's
yun.
12 o'clock. That's the way we've been conditioned. We've been told that lunch gani, break na ta, hunong na sa trabaho, kaon na. Again, nothing wrong with these conditions, these conditionings, but there are other dysfunctional conditionings,
Dysfunctional conditioning.
such as the thought that every time I fail, I tell myself I'm good for nothing.
Mm.
That's a more serious conditioning that we need to be looking at. So look at conditionings, look at the programs that run your life. Evaluate these programs. Kana dito mga habits are automatic responses man. Murag reflexive na siya. Di ba? You don't think about them kay na habit na buhat na lang. No murag switch nga kada click something happens. Study these programs. Fourth, radical behaviorism. Ang kaning radical behaviorism tells us or teaches us about the importance of reinforcement. No? Kana bitawng kadungog na ka na journal na moingon nga I will reward myself, no?
Mm.
Moingon nga mag-breaks ako kay I will reward myself kay nalipay ko sa akong trabaho. That can be habit forming, di ba? That can
Yes.
help you form habits when you reward or reinforce particular behaviors. Don't forget to give yourself a pat, tell yourself kanang I'm proud of me, no? Just telling yourself na I'm proud of myself today. Before ka matulog mo yung ka nga sus kanang nalipay kay ko sa kong kaugalingon kay I've achieved something. That's habit forming because the next day you're bound to do it again. Mas ganahan ka, mas ganado ka nga mubuhat ana balik.
Motivated kay ka.
Motivated ka when you reinforce or reward yourself. Fifth and last, to answer the question of what can we do to change our habits has something to do in my study with the works of Clark Hall and Ivan Pavlov. Again, classical conditioning. The difference is in the Hullian theory, there is more emphasis on our thoughts. So, we're na-cover na no sa behavioral technology, na-cover na ang situation, na-cover na ang atong stimulus, ang atong feelings. It might not sound very behavioral anymore, and this is the point of Hull. The point of Clark Hull was to say that if we want to change behaviors, we might need to go beyond behaviors. We might need to look at our thoughts and our feelings. No? And this is what's good about neo-behaviorism. Neo-behaviorism is suggesting that we cannot understand human beings just by behaviors. Ni ipasiya ba sa behavioral project. We have to consider what we think and how we feel. And that's the last part. After looking at the situation, the SORC statement, after studying our programming and associations, after rewarding ourselves for good behaviors or healthier habits, we can then look to our thoughts and our feelings in the tradition of Clark Hall.
Sige. So daghan tag mga nakatuna no sa katong behavioral technology ba to o something. Daghan tag nakatunan sa kining situation pa lang daan no sa pag analyze atong kaugalingon ug dapat aware ta sa kining panghitabo no. So daghan pa no. Last part no sa kining kuan ato ang podcast karon is kining ato ang mga groups nga free groups nga gipahigayon sa clinic. So yes, naatay mga free groups nga gipahigayon sa clinic. So at pwede nimo i-explain na mo Sir Rob kung unsa man yung mga groups ug unsa puy tagsa-tagsa ka benefits ani nga free ra ni siya ha. Free ni siya so wa mo bayaran no. All you need to do is to contact us and then register sa mo sa website and then kung ano mo sa session kay schedule man ni siya no. So pwede nimo i-storya kung saan yung mga groups Robby o kung saan mga benefits nga ilahang madawat no kung attend sila or mo-attend sila niya itong mga free groups.
Thank you, Jurley, for also sharing the gift of these free groups, the
Yes.
support that these free groups bring to those who might need them. There are, at the moment, 4 free groups that are run by the clinic. There's the mental health hour, Cebu, every Saturday from 3 to 5. Gandang Gandang Buhay, also every Saturday evening from 8 to 9. There's co-support, Mondays at 11 a.m. And First Step, every Tuesday at 2:30.
Mm.
How do or what do these groups offer or provide?
Yes.
In terms of, in relation to what we've been discussing in the last hour, um, habits.
Habits.
If there's one word that I'd like to pick up, and um, if this is the last question, close this podcast with, it's learning.
Learning.
One thing that makes these groups habit forming um, spaces is because of the learning that occurs in these groups. Again, I take from the graduate thesis that I've picked up for this podcast. On one page, it talks about learning theory, and just to read the beginning part of the section, and also end with with uh, with that, it says, and I quote, just as behavioral change is made possible by behavioral technology, all those methods we talked about earlier, learning theory forms a foundation for behavioral technology. I finished by saying the major aspects of behaviorism: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, modeling, and language acquisition. What they turn to, if there's one word to summarize them all, is learning. Um, in other words, the free groups offer opportunities to learn.
Of learning.
Um, when we try to change our habits, whatever method you're trying out, because there are so many methods, Gerald. There are so many ways of, um, if you listen to, if you look at YouTube, if you go to the internet, there are so many things that
Yes.
people recommend that we do, and we're just at the tip of the iceberg. In fact, when we're talking about behavioral technology, but all these things require learning. You can't change habits if you're not willing to learn. In other words,
Yes, for
you will
sure.
have to learn something if you want to change your habits. In psychological terms, you will have to change, and be ready and be open to making those changes. Unless you are open, changing those habits will never happen. They will never occur for you. The free groups, from Mental Health Hour to Gandang Gandang Buhay, Co-Support, and First Step, offers our friends out there the opportunity to learn,
To learn.
to pick up new habits, to form better ones, to drop bad ones, and to create healthier and more adaptive ones. I hope that for this year, for 2023, these will extend. The gift of these free support groups will extend our desire to be able to change your habits for the better.
So by joining these free support groups that RB Psychological Services offer, um, mo ni siya kining mga naidaghang mga ways dire para makabuild kag new habits, no, as kanang Sir Robby said, no, nga mao ni siya ato ang kining unang tikang, no. So kung willing mo, just contact us, and we will help you register to our website, and then yeah, magkita-kita ta dito. So thank you so much, Sir Robby, for your time, no.
My pleasure.
I know busy kay ka din. Thank you po sa ato ang mga tigpaminaw o atong mga viewers, no, nga nagsuporta gihapon sa RB Psychological Services. And with that, thank you so much.